Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Security Spotlight series by Google. Your hosts today, myself, Marie Chidoli, and Roy D'Souza. We're both focused on Chronicle enablement within the Google Cloud Security. And we have a special guest from our adoption engineering team today, Dan Dye, we're gonna introduce him in a moment. I bet you're thinking, what are we going to talk about today? So I know that when you're looking to configure something new, especially when it's a product as complex as Chronicle, product documentation can be super helpful, but sometimes we need a little bit more help. It's not always super straightforward based on what exactly we're trying to do. And today, Dan is here as our guest to talk to us about updating reference lists with Python. While Chronicle doesn't offer a full SDK or software development kit, we do post sample code on how to enhance Chronicle's APIs. Today, Dan is going to talk us through how to customize these samples to better work for you in your environment. I am going to hand it off to Roy to talk to us a little bit more about, go through, some Q&A or some interview style questions with Dan, but I do want to remind everyone, we will have live Q&A at the end. Please post all of your questions. Try to keep them as relevant to the topic as possible. We'll try to cover everything we can. And if we are not able to get to your question, or if it's not directly relevant, please follow up in the community and we'll spark up some lively conversation there. Otherwise, Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Marie, for that amazing introduction. I, for one, am super excited about today's session. I think it's going to shine a light on something that Chronicle users face. And before we get right into it, I did want to take this opportunity again to show our gratitude to all of you for making this series what it is. Thank you so much for the 3 successful episodes, and we look forward to more feedback and to bring you this every month. So why don't we get started? Well, Dan, we have this thing where before we get right into the important stuff, we do like to show and share the spotlight on the speaker. And we're so excited you're here with us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How long have you been at Google, and what do you do here?
Sure. I've been at Google for 6 months, and my job title is Cloud Security Adoption Engineer. And that role, it's kind of a blend between customer engineer, developer advocate, and technology evangelist. And our mission is to make cloud security customers successful. We work directly with customers to solve concrete problems, but then afterwards, we try to make those solutions more broadly available by sharing code, by writing, speaking, just sharing the solutions. For example, my teammate David French has been blogging and speaking about detection as code. And that's where you sync your detection rules with in Chronicle with a GitHub repo, and you get all of the benefits of change tracking. It's a lot like it's infrastructure as code, where you manage resources with tools like Terraform, rather than untracked changes that from clicking through in the Google Cloud Console. And I have been using that project myself in my own Chronicle lab environment, and it's making me successful. So I think it's really useful for customers too. Another example, my teammate John Stoner has a great blog series. It's the New to Chronicle series, and I highly recommend that. That's helped me to learn YARA-L, which was new to me when I started. And I think it's a great example of speeding up customer onboarding and learning the more sophisticated features faster, which improves customer success.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for shining the spotlight on other relevant resources we have. And, a little bit more about you, though, Dan. How did you get into the world of security? What was your inspiration? And we would love to hear about that.
Okay. I've been in InfoSec for 10 years, but I like to say it's my second career. My first programming job in 2001 was doing scientific computing. I was hired my junior year in university by a research institute to do environmental modeling and remote sensing of the coastal ocean. And that led me to study remote sensing in graduate school, which at my university was offered through the geography department. So I got a master's in geography. I learned cloud computing, machine learning, and Python because those are all important in geo. And those skills all overlap with InfoSec as well. So in 2014, I heard from a recruiter about a role that sounded really interesting. It used Django and MongoDB, which were both technologies that I was really interested in at that time. And that was my first security job. And it was for the Soltra Edge threat intelligence platform. And that was intended to help critical infrastructure verticals to share data within themselves among the ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. So for example, the financial services ISAC, it lets the big banks share threat intelligence and activity amongst themselves because the threat actors that are targeting them, they use the same infrastructure and the same tactics to attack other banks. So I started because of my interest in the technology, but immediately I understood the importance of the mission. Critical infrastructure is vulnerable to hacking, and we need to protect it. That infrastructure is critical.
And how glad we are to have you with us. I just love how these stories come together, how you start with so many different experiences and that brings you into this world of Google security that you are an ambassador for today. So thank you so much for joining us again. Now, before we get in, maybe you can give us a brief, quick overview of what you will be presenting today, and then, the stage is all yours.
Okay, so this spotlight is on managing reference lists, and it was motivated by a customer request for enhancement for the reference list API, the server-side API. And the request was to support appending new items to an existing list. And that's a legitimate feature request, and I'm internally advocating for it. But there is an existing workaround that I wanted to share with that customer in the interim. You can get the existing list, take your new items, append them onto the existing list, and then perform the update instead of doing the append. So it effectively becomes an append operation, even though the API doesn't currently support it. So I want to show that solution, and for that customer and others who might want to do the same thing. And it's also a great opportunity to showcase the APIs themselves and client code for interacting with it. We've got artifacts for this, samples on GitHub repo, in blog posts, now this live demo. So I'm hoping to help customers become better with those APIs and with the Python client code.
Perfect. Another example of us bringing and showcasing real world requests to our audience. Well, without further ado, then Dan, the stage is all yours. Please, it's showtime.
All right. Should be seeing my first slides now, right? All right, so the goal here is to talk about Python client code for the Chronicle API. In February's Security Spotlight, Rob Becker described orchestration of reference lists using Chronicle SecOps. And at the very end of that, there was a question about doing those same kinds of reference list operations with Python. And that's what I'm going to cover today. So the rest of the spotlight is looking at code. So I want to first show an example of the reference list in the Chronicle web UI. Now, this one contains 6 file hashes, and it's a string type reference list. I say string there because there are 3 types of reference lists. There's string like this one, regular expression, and then cider notation. And you can search for values that are contained within a reference list, both with URL detection rules and also in UDM search. So here's an example of UDM search for a file hash that's contained in the reference list that we just looked at. And the syntax for that search is in, the word in, in, and then %, and then that's followed by the name of the reference list. So the name of this one is Cold River SHA-256. And on this slide, I also have a second example right below that, and that's showing search for a single hard-coded list. So the search in list is a replacement for places where you might do that, that single search. You can search for all of the values that are in a list. So for file hashes, if you have polymorphic malware and it has multiple hashes, you can do all of those hashes within the list, for example. So let's move on to the coding. Here are search results for the Chronicle API. And the first two are reference documents, and we're going to look at those in a bit. The third one is the Google GitHub repo that has a collection of Python examples for doing things like getting and updating reference lists. And that's what we're looking at. But that GitHub repo is not an SDK. It's not a software development kit. Instead, it's a collection of samples, and it's to help you get started and to do whatever you need with those APIs. So you may need to take some of those samples and rework them for your own needs. And I want to demonstrate how you can do that. Now, I should mention that there is an SDK for Chronicle, and I'm going to show its doc page in the next slide, but it isn't a complete SDK. It doesn't cover all of the API endpoints. So these samples are to help you fill those gaps. And to that end, by the end of this demo, I intend for you to be able to clone the repo, modify one of the existing example files, use the Chronicle API in a way that is not provided by the examples. And I'm actually going to scoop myself and start with that. I'm going to show a really quick example of doing exactly that. And then I'm going to back up and I'm going to walk through the documentation and the requirements for using these samples in more detail. Now, that documentation is used to build we're going to build the most simple example using that documentation. And we're going to do that from scratch. So from zero, build one example using the reference documentation. And as we look at the documentation, I'm going to point out a few pitfalls and hopefully show you how to avoid them. And I can tell you right now, most of those pitfalls are around getting the authentication for the various APIs correct. So here's that SDK that I mentioned. This is in the Python package index. So you can pip install this package. And you can see that it covers feeds, parsers, and forwarders, but it doesn't cover ingestion, reference lists, and so on. So the API samples Python repo, it helps to fill that gap. And here is that lightning tour that I mentioned. So on the right, there is a git list example, and this is the example that's provided in the GitHub repo. And at the top, in the red box, there's some boilerplate for cloning the repo, creating a virtual environment, activating the virtual environment, installing the third-party libraries that are defined in the requirements.txt file. So pip install requirements.txt. And then below that, the Python M statement that's in the blue box, that shows the most simple example of one of these sample scripts. And it, as implied by the name, it gets the contents of a reference list and it prints that to standard out. Now, this invocation, it's taking advantage of the default location for the service account credentials. So authentication and authorization aren't shown here. but I will speak to those later. This script, as written and as in the GitHub repo, it only outputs the contents of the reference list. And you can see that on the screen here. They're line delimited, just like we saw in the Chronicle web UI. It's a list of strings. Now, let's suppose your automation script also needs to get the description, the last modification time, or something other than the contents. So to do that, you could make a copy of getlist.py, make some small changes to suit your needs. And that is what I have done here. So I copied the original example file and I made a few changes. And I called my modified version getlist.json.py. And give you a second to look at the delta on the screen. The old code's on the left and the new's on the right. Deleted lines in red, added lines in green. So here are the results of those changes. The output of the old script is on the top. And again, it prints the contents in a way that would be suitable for saving into a plain text file, like save it into list.txt. And the modified output on the bottom is the JSON representation. And I would save that to a .json file. Alternatively, that output on the bottom could also be piped into another shell command, like the JSON command line processor, JQ. And we'll see examples of that as we build a script from scratch. So that's the end goal. I want to be able to make those kinds of modifications to the existing Python samples. And there are a few complications that I glossed over. So I want to start back at the beginning, and we need to understand the reference documentation for the APIs in order to use those APIs. And we need to understand authorization and authentication. So back to the Google search results for Chronicle API. And we already looked at the third link shown with the black arrow, the Python samples and utilities. But now we need to see these reference docs, which are shown at the red and the yellow arrows. And modifying existing scripts often requires information from these reference docs. So I clicked through on the Search API one, and I now see in the sidebar on the left the list of all of the APIs, and the reference list API has the red arrow pointing at it. That's the one I'm interested in. And there's a fair bit of duplicate information between these different APIs, but there are also sometimes important differences. So I want to call these out. All of these API pages have the same information at the top. One, it says there's a Google API client library for OAuth 2 that's in your own language, and Python is our language here. Right below that, number 2, there's a link to that Google Auth library for Python, and that's the one that we're using today, and I'm going to show that on the next slide. And then number 3, there are links to other Google Auth libraries for other languages. And I'm showing that list of languages in this inset box on the right. At the black arrow, it says that my Chronicle representative will provide me with a Google Developer Service Account credential for the API. And that needs some additional explanation. So I'm going to speak to that in a few slides. Lastly, every one of these pages shows the scope for the reference lists API. And this one ends in Chronicle backstory. But this value does change for different APIs. So we need to look at that as well. So following the link for the Google Auth library for Python, this is the read the docs page for the Python package. The package itself is in the Python package index, the PyPy index, because that's redundant. So you can pip install it. You can include it in your requirements.txt file and so on. The inset box is showing the example for doing authentication with a service account JSON file, which is how the API samples authenticate. But there is one small modification. You can also provide a scope keyword argument to the from service account file method. And that's what's done in the example scripts that are on GitHub. And that's what we're going to do together today. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I will show again later, that the scope does change for the different APIs. So that's something to be careful about. When you copy an old API to make a new one, you need to refer to the documentation to ensure that you've got the right scope or the right list of scopes. Here is that scope information again from the Chronicle API documentation. The reference lists API, it uses a scope that ends in Chronicle backstory. And the other arrow is pointing to the requirement for service account credentials. Now, I got a bit confused on this point because I had different credentials for different APIs. And I've got more on that on the next slide. When I first started working with these Chronicle APIs, I lost track of which service account credentials went with which API. I had two different JSON files, and I couldn't remember which was for what. And I am hoping that I can save you this trouble. The file name and a lot of the contents of the service account credential, they don't really give you a lot of clues about what it's used for. It doesn't anywhere in there say reference list API. But what I learned to look for is the client email, and that tells me how to identify the service account. And then this table maps the three different service accounts that I had for the various APIs. And backstory and ingestion are those are the ones that I was confusing. So let me show you the difference in the client emails between those two. So here is that clue in the client email fields of the JSON files with the service account credentials. BK is for backstory, and ing is for ingestion. So that's the clue. You can also see that I have renamed the files themselves to give them more meaningful names. I've appended ingestion API, backstory API, and then I have duplicate service with backstory API using underscores below it. So that helps you to look from the file name itself, but looking inside the file, you can also get this information. The BigQuery service account, also that credential also has the same clue. It has BQE in place of BK or ING. And here again is that table. It has the backstory versus ingestion APIs, BK for backstory, and ing for ingestion. And those service account names, they also align with the scopes. Ingestion has one scope, and backstory has a different scope. And I'm going to show that now. So if you visit each one of these pages and you look at the scope information, you will find that one of these things is not like the others. All but one of them have a scope that ends with Chronicle backstory, except for ingestion. And ingestion's scope ends with Malachite ingestion. So for the scope names are also a clue for how to group together which APIs go with which service account, the backstory service account versus the ingestion service account. And to keep these organized, I recommend adding context to the file name as soon as you get them. Now, if you do make a mistake with the scope, and you have some error handling for the API response, there is a readable error message. It says access token scope insufficient. Now, I guess if I wasn't on the lookout for scope issues, I might misread that the JSON lacks the authorization, but it is here trying to say that the scope is the problem. And you can compare that to the message, if you use the wrong JSON credentials entirely, you get permission denied. Okay, with that out of the way, I want to go back to looking at the reference list API and its documentation. This page has Python example code, and you can see in the assignment to the scopes global variable that it's using the Chronicle backstory scope. So that same information is in a second place on the same documentation page. And the next line is then assigning service account file, all caps, service under account under file. And I have a service account that has entitlements for all of the backstory APIs, except BigQuery. And they all use that same scope. So I can use that one service account credentials for everything except for ingestion and for BigQuery. And that service account file variable, it's taking the path to the service account credentials that are on disk. It's not the contents of the service account file. I guess that's kind of implied by the file name. So above those two global variable assignments, and also above the imports, there are contents that are telling us to instruct or to install a Python package, the Google API Python client, and that's going to satisfy both of the imports that follow the comment, those two import lines. So here's that Python package index page, the pypy.org. It has some indicators that this is a trustworthy package. I'm always on the lookout for typo squat packages, but this does not look like one. So again, here's that same boilerplate that we saw earlier for creating a Python virtual environment and then installing that package, pip install the package. And below that, the first two imports work at the Python REPL, the read, evaluate, print loop, denoted by the chevron prompt. So installing, the package was installed okay, and we've now got validation that what we installed satisfies both of those imports. So I said earlier, we're going to build the API client script from scratch. And we're going to do that by prototyping with the Python REPL like this one. And then we'll move the prototype code into a script, and then we'll refactor the script into a module. Following along with the reference documentation sample code, we now see the definition of the two global variables, scopes and service account file. And it might seem weird to hard code those things, but the documentation, it's following a common pattern with Python development here. When a utility is immature and it's under development, it's common to configure things that change at the top and maybe even add a don't change below this line comment. And so we're starting with that. But as we mature the script to become a reusable module, we'll move those things to become configurable parameters. The line following the globals that uses the imported package to, it handles the authentication. And it uses those two configurable things, the path to the service account file and the scope. And note that the scope is actually scopes, plural, and we're passing it a list with one item in it. Don't pass it just the string itself. It does need to be enclosed in a list. That's a Python, I don't know, pitfall that a string is also an iterable, so it can be confusing if you get that wrong. the Python example in the documentation, it stops at that point. There's no more Python code, but the rest of the page does show us the HTTP method for the example that we're working with, which is get, and then it shows the URI. And that URI, it has a placeholder variable. The things in the braces are a variable named list name, and you need to substitute your own list name at that point. I'd like to do this by assigning a variable and use the same name that is in the documentation. So documentation has list name, I have list name. And I'm showing that here in the REPL. And the nice thing about this is that now the URL, where the URL is assigned using the F string, it's exactly the same as in the documentation. But that URL assignment is using F string to interpolate the variable, the list name variable, to create the URI with your list included in it. So we're still working in the Python REPL to test out the rest of this, and the REPL after this last line, it's going to print the response from that HTTP client request. And here is that response. It's pretty hard to read in this state. So let's see what we can do to clean that up. First, I'm going to capture the response instead of just printing the output directly from the REPL. Capture it to a variable, and then try pretty printing that. But it's still not great. But I can now see that there are two things. The first, in response 0, is the HTTP response header. And then the second is the string version of the response. And that's what we're after. When I was putting these slides together, I got a little red squiggly line under referrer, because this is indeed a misspelling, but it is the correct misspelling. The spelling of referrer is actually included in the first HTTP specification, and it wasn't caught until after it was published. And by that time, it was too late. Changing it would break all kinds of things. So we're stuck with this spelling of referrer for apparently ever. Since it's the JSON that I'm after in this, what I can do is load that second item, response 1, and then dump it back to pretty print it. And now it looks like what I've wanted. I've got the indenting that makes this, more readable. So this JSON load and JSON dumps, it's a little inelegant, but it's because we're getting the string version of the JSON. It works, and it's using only the standard library. So we're gonna go with that approach for now. So I now have a complete soup to nuts REPL session for getting a reference list, and that's all that I need to create a standalone Python script for this. Typically at this point, I like to clean it and verify it, because I've got a REPL session that has some mistakes in it. So I copy the history into a text editor, clean it up, and then paste the whole session back, this clean and sanitized session back. And that's what I've done here. You can see I've exited, and then I've just pasted from the clipboard the entire thing. And it works, and it prints only the JSON as the output. So it's exactly what I'm trying to do. And this maturity pattern is prove that it works in the REPL, and then use the REPL code in a .py file. I'm doing the REPL here. I actually normally do this kind of work with Jupyter notebooks, but I'm trying to, for this demo, just stick with minimum libraries, only the things that are required in the requirements.txt. So stick with the standard library as much as possible. But Jupyter's great for that. REPL also works. So here's that same code that we saw in the REPL, and it's now in a .py file. and I've called it get list. And it still has the service account file and that list name. They're both hard coded, but this is on the path to maturity. So let's test this. Now you can see from my command prompt at the very top that I have the virtual environment active. On the far left, it's showing Chronicle under API. That's the name of my virtual environment. And I'm calling the script with Python get list, and it prints the output just like the REPL did. So, so it works. All right, I also mentioned earlier that a nice benefit of printing the JSON to standard out like this, and only the JSON, is that I can pipe the results from standard out into a command line processor, JQ. And here, JQ is stripping out all but the array of hashes. And that's starting to look like that first version that we saw, where one version had the JSON, one version had the plain text version, as you would put into a .text file. This isn't quite there because these are still wrapped in quotes. They have trailing commas. There's square brackets wrapping the whole list of them. So let's work with JQ to clean that up a little bit further. So here I've removed the trailing commas and those leading and trailing square bracket by using dot lines and then open close square bracket. And with one more change, adding the -r or -- raw output flag, that removes the quotes. And now we have the line delimited list of hash values, and it's just like the output that we saw earlier. So this is handy because we can use a single script, and it can emit the JSON file, or we can use a JQ pipeline to emit the text representation of it. It does both. So that example from the beginning where we cloned an existing get to get list JSON, we could actually just use get list JSON, and then we can chain commands together for the get list results. It can do both. So this is a win for the Unix philosophy of modularity and reusability. Okay, so let's circle back to maturing this script. We need to fix these two hard-coded values. Now, we can do that most simply with positional arguments. And here, sysargv1 is the service account, and sysargv2, it's the list name, and that works. This is now bare bones working script. It could be better. Right now, the user needs to know which order in which to provide those positional arguments. And there's a good Python package to lean on for making user-friendly command line interfaces. Actually, there are several good ones. In the Python standard library, there's argparse, and we're trying to stick with the standard library here, so that's what we're going to use. But if you're willing to install more third-party packages, I'm a fan of docopt and Google's Abseil. These are both great libraries for creating command line interfaces for standalone Python modules. They've got some additional features that can be really useful. So instead of positional arguments, we want to name our arguments, and we want them to follow an existing convention if one exists. So here on the right are the names from the get list from the GitHub repo. This is the one where you see -m lists get list. This is what's in GitHub, not the one that we're writing. It's the one that is already there. And it has existing conventions, and we want to follow existing conventions if possible. So you can see it uses the double dash command line parameters, -- name and -- credentials file to pass those two values into the script. The arg parse documentation is shown here, and it shows that you can optionally provide a single dash version and a single letter variation for the params if you want. So instead of dash dash list file, it might be dash f, and you can use either one. And while we're looking for inspiration for these sample files and looking for naming conventions, let's go ahead and peek at the create list as well. The get list example, it follows dash dash name, dash dash credentials file, and list file. It also has a couple of new parameters that we haven't seen: content type and description. So when you're creating, you need to supply those. When you're updating or getting, you don't need to supply those. So to update our bare bones working example, we're going to start with a single arg, and it's done with this block that's shown here. And most of this is boilerplate. It's the same whenever you use arg parse. So the important bit, the part that changes, is between the ellipses there, and it's the add argument. I grabbed this snippet directly from the lists getPy sample file, and we can just drop those in. So we have the same naming convention, dash n for name or dash dash name for this argument. And we're building up what's required. So we're, in our version, we're not implementing the list file. That's the provide the name of a file to emit the list. Instead, we're using command line redirection. If you want to go into a text file, redirect into filename.txt or redirect into filename.json. So that only leaves the credentials file. We got to create that argument next. All right, unlike the name argument, here credentials file is not a required argument. In the name one, we see that required is true, and that's not specified at all. Required is not specified for the other. So the default is false. The existing examples have that default, and the default is defined at a module level global in all caps at the top of the script. And it's the user's directory and in a file called Chronicle credentials. So it's right here, all caps, default credentials file. Use the pathlib to find what's the user's home directory, and then hidden file, the dot, and credentials.json. And then that gets used down here. It's printing in the help what your value is for that, and then used here to actually assign it to the variable. So if we make a copy from the samples, we get this new version of the Python script, and I'm now calling this one v3. You can see in the top here, this is get Python v3. And here on the right, you can see it being called with a single parameter, the reference list name. And so it's taking advantage of that default for the credential file location. This is a little confusing because, as I covered earlier, you could be using multiple JSON files for different APIs, and which one gets saved into that location, Chronicle credentials JSON, which one is the default. And when you switch between using the APIs, is the current Chronicle credentials file, is that default the one that you need? So I prefer to avoid this confusion and instead just require that the credentials path is always provided, rather than using that kind of magical behavior of the default. So let's refactor this into a version 4 version that removes that unwanted feature. All right, here is the diff between v3 and v4, where credentials file is now a required arg. So we get to drop the pathlib, no longer required. We get to drop assigning the default variables. And this new line is added, required equals true. We update the help because we no longer have a default value. So just say credentials file path. And then this bit of magic here where we toggle between the default or the let the user provided ones override it is no longer needed and becomes simply arg's credential file. So it's simplifying the script a fair bit, and I think making it more clear for end users as well. So there we have it. We now have a get list script that stands on its own, and it's built from the documentation with a little inspiration for command line arg names from the GitHub repo. There's one more thing that I want to change. I called this a script because right now it's one big block of procedural code, and it doesn't have any functions. So let's move the script into functions, and then it can be used as a module. So that it would be hard to do a diff here because there are so many changed lines. So I have the old on the left and the new on the right. V4 becomes V5. And what has really changed is all this CLI parsing stuff that happens here, all the parser, that's been moved into the if name equals main block. So if it's being called as a module, this is used, but if it's not needed. And the part that calls the URL right here, we define the URL, that's moved into a function called getList, which is the same as the module name. And rather than pretty printing the data inside the function, that's done by returning the value and then doing the pretty printing down here back in the main block. And that's important because that makes the getList function useful for other modules. They can import getList from getList. They can pass an authenticated client and the list name that they're after, and they can get back the dictionary representation from the list file and maybe use that as code. And they don't have to do this string processing stuff. So the module itself is printing the string to standard output, pretty printed JSON string to standard output, but we want to return a dictionary from this to make it modular code. And we're going to see that can come in handy. So the next step, we've now finished the from scratch component of this. And the next, we're going to take that use case that I described in the beginning, where the API does update, but we want it to append. So on the left is the update list example. And this is the script that's on the GitHub repo. The reference list API, it only supports replacement of existing lists. It doesn't support appending new content to an existing list. But the Python module on the right is going to do this. So on the left, it only overwrites. And the new case where you want to append, we're going to follow the same process. You take the original script, which is append update list, give it a new name, append to list in this case, try to make a meaningful name. And the code on the right is taking advantage of that get list example that we just created. It's doing the import of the get list function, and that's defined in the get list module. So the import statement is from get list import get list, and the new items are appended to the existing list, and then so you take the existing, append the new ones, and then update, and the whole list is overwritten. So from the user's perspective, this is an append operation. They're only providing the new content. They have no knowledge of what's in the list already. And I could see many cases where, in automation, consuming from a stream and you just want to say what the new items are. But it is an overwrite behind the scenes. So let's look at some examples of that in action, make it a little more concrete. So here's the output from get list, and it's those 6 items that are being returned. And then this is I have some dummy values for what I'm going to append to this list, and it's line delimited. And note that there are some duplicates in here. Foo and bar are both duplicated in this. So when I invoke the append to list, get back that it was successfully updated, and in the next slide, do get again, and you can see there are the original values, and then the new values, the deduplicated new values, are appended to the end of that. Likewise, I took this example a little bit further. I'm not going to show the code changes for this, but remove from list does the similar thing. So given a list file, it can take those contents and delete them from an existing list. So doing a get one more time afterwards, you see we're back to the original state with just the original 6 without all the foo bars in there. I should say both of those examples, append to list and get list, are now live as of Thursday last week. They're on that GitHub repo that I showed, the Chronicle API samples Python. So both there, and I think we're going to take some Q&A at this point. I'll leave these links on the screen so we can look at those as we go through any questions that have arisen during this.
Thank you so much, Dan. Roy, do you want to go ahead and start with the first question?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Appreciate the presentation. I think we're almost at the hour, so I think we do have time for maybe a couple of questions. The first one, Dan, is, can people use this code to manage reference lists in Chronicle via a CI/CD pipeline? And if so, how might people go about doing that?
Via CI/CD pipeline. So I would think, well, I think David's example of detection as code would be a really good thing for you to look at. And I think I can add some links after this presentation to like the YouTube page for it and show that, because that really is, it's treating the reference lists themselves, the detection rules as code, committing them to you have a Git repo with reference lists on change to a file in there that could trigger an update to synchronize your code repository with the reference lists that are live. So yes, I think that is very much possible and desirable. I think I know that customers are doing that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think we have one more question. What other content in Chronicle can be managed via its API? Dan, I think you might have some more information about this in one of your recent blog posts, but I'll let you speak to that.
I have not yet encountered anything that cannot be managed by the API. I'm not positive that there isn't something like that, but so far, everything that I have had to make changes to, there is corresponding API to update those things. If you have if you have an exact example, is this thing covered? I could give you an exact example, but I think some of the slides showed, like in the reference list, or I'm sorry, in the API documentation, those were the categories of things. So like ingestion is a category. Within ingestion, there are sub things like there's unified data model ingestion, and there's ingestion via parser. So it's not just, that's not the comprehensive list. It's kind of the outline, and then there are sub bullets for those things. But I think there's very good coverage of the APIs for managing Chronicle in an automated way.
Awesome. Well, I think that was pretty helpful. Thank you. And also a huge thank you for covering all this content today. I think it's definitely some pretty helpful stuff that we've been hearing a lot of questions on. So I appreciate you taking the time and putting all of this together. We will have, this recording will be available in our YouTube playlist. We have a couple of links here that I just want to cover quickly on the screen. So you can access our security community by going to the top URL. If you would like to give us feedback on this presentation on this month's Security Spotlight series, please go ahead and utilize the second URL. And then we also have a few exciting events that are up and coming that you can go ahead and check out additional information. All of these events are posted in our security events page, on our security events page in the community. And I have some other exciting news for everyone here. It's that I will be taking a more active role in our user community. I'll have my first post out there later today. You can find information from me in the forums section of our security community. My goal is to get you a couple of valuable posts each week, again, in the forums. So let's go ahead and do what we can to drive some lively conversation. I know that I've been driving all additional questions over to the community. So hopefully we'll chat more there. Otherwise, everyone, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And Dan, most of all, we really appreciate you taking the time to cover this great content for us today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Yay. Thanks. Bye, everyone.